Welcome to Nightmare Fuel Stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoy the stories. The air in the old Atlas textile mill always tasted of dust and decay, a familiar cocktail of pulverized brick, dried-out bird droppings, and the metallic tang of rust. For Alex it was home, not literally of course. His apartment was a clean, sterile box downtown, a stark contrast to the sprawling skeletal remains he meticulously explored. But Atlas, like so many other hulks of forgotten industry, was where he felt most alive, or at least most present. Today, the usual thrill was tinged with an unfamiliar prickle on his neck. He'd been exploring Atlas for years, documenting its slow surrender to time, its graffiti-scarred walls, and the slow creep of nature reclaiming concrete. He knew its every creak and groan, every hollow echo. He'd even found the old boiler room where a group of local teens occasionally partied, leaving behind empty beer cans and the faint scent of stale weed. He knew its secrets, or so he thought. His heavy-duty flashlight cut a swathe through the gloom of the third floor, past gutted offices and vast, empty factory floors where looms once roared. The silence was the first thing. Not the usual ambient silence of an abandoned building, the rustle of wind through broken windows, the drip of unseen water, the distant city hum, but a profound, almost stifling stillness. It felt wrong. As if the building itself was holding its breath, he checked his GoPro, secured to his chest harness, ensuring the red light was blinking. Atlas Mill, Sector C, third floor, routine survey. Odd silence today, he murmured, his voice sounding too loud, too vulnerable in the oppressive quiet. He pushed further into a section he rarely visited, a warren of smaller rooms off the main factory floor, likely administrative offices or storage. Most were collapsed, their ceilings fallen, their contents indistinguishable piles of splintered wood and plaster. But then he saw it, a door, not just a door but a door, not sagging on its hinges, not splintered and gray, but intact. Painted a dull, unassuming beige and more crucially, closed. Not jammed, not collapsed, but firmly shut, it looked new. Or at least maintained. Alex paused, his flashlight beam fixed on it. His heart gave a curious lurch, a mix of curiosity and an almost primal unease. He'd explored hundreds of buildings, thousands of rooms. He knew what abandon looked like, and this wasn't it. He reached out, his gloved hand hovering over the doorknob. It was an old-fashioned, brass-bladed knob, gleaming faintly in his light. No rust, no dust. His fingers wrapped around it, cold and solid. He twisted. It turned, smooth as butter. The door opened inward with barely a whisper, revealing not the expected debris or a collapsed void, but a small, neat room. It was a living room, or what passed for one. A threadbare sofa, faded green, sat against one wall. A small, sturdy wooden table with a chipped ceramic mug and a dog-eared paperback rested in the center. An old, boxy television sat on a low stand, its screen dark. The walls were painted a soft, muted yellow, untouched by graffiti or damp. There was even a patterned rug on the concrete floor. It was impossibly clean. There was no dust motes dancing in the limited light, no spiderwebs. It smelled faintly of old paper and something else, something sweet like dried potpourri. Alex stood utterly still, his breath hitched in his throat, his mind scrambled, trying to process this anomaly. Squatters. But squatters didn't maintain rooms like this. They didn't paint walls and vacuum rugs, and how had he never seen it before? This wasn't some hidden alcove, this was a room accessible from a main corridor. He took a tentative step inside, his boots strangely loud on the clean rug. He swept his flashlight around. Every item was unremarkable, yet profoundly out of place. The paperback on the table was a worn copy of a mid-20th century mystery novel. The mug had a faded floral pattern. Nothing new, nothing valuable, just used, recently used. His gaze fell on an ashtray, surprisingly clean, on the small table next to the sofa. A single extinguished cigarette butt rested in it, its filter slightly flattened. It looked like it had been put out mere hours ago. "Hello," he called out, his voice cracking slightly. The silence that followed was absolute, deeper than before. It felt as if the air itself was absorbing his sound, not reflecting it. He felt a prickle of genuine fear, a cold, creeping sensation that was more than just the thrill of discovery. This was wrong, fundamentally wrong. He backed out of the room slowly, his eyes never leaving the interior. He pulled the door shut, the click of the latch echoing in the sudden return of absolute quiet. He stared at the beige door for a long moment, then turned and hurried away, his flashlight beam bouncing erratically, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He didn't look back. That night's sleep was a distant memory. The image of that impossibly neat room, the smell of potpourri, the single cigarette butt, replayed in his mind. He reviewed his GoPro footage, fast-forwarding through the familiar stretches of the mill. When he got to the corridor, he slowed it down. He saw himself approach the door. He saw himself open it. He saw himself enter. But the footage inside the room was distorted, a blur of static and garbled sound before it cut out entirely, only to resume as he exited. It was as if the camera, his trusty digital eye, had refused to capture what he'd seen. Or couldn't, he tried to rationalize. A rogue caretaker, a secret art installation, a particularly dedicated group of role players, but none of it fit the profound sense of wrongness he'd felt. The next day, the obsession began. He returned to Atlas. He wanted to prove it was a trick of the light, a figment of his sleep-deprived imagination. He went directly to the third floor. To Sector C, the corridor was exactly as he'd left it. Strewn with debris, light-starved, dripping with the slow, melancholic decay of abandonment. But the beige door wasn't there. Where it should have been, there was nothing but a gaping hole in the wall, revealing a mess of splintered plaster and exposed brick. No door frame, no hinge marks, no trace of a beige door. It was as if it had never existed. Alex stood there for a long time, his mind reeling. He checked his GoPro again, scrolling through the previous day's footage. It showed him walking towards a perfectly intact wall, reaching out and pushing through what appeared to be solid brick before the static kicked in. When he exited, he was simply stepping back from the same solid wall. His hands began to shake. He wasn't just tired. He wasn't hallucinating. Something impossible was happening. His urban exploration shifted from a hobby to a frantic quest. He started revisiting every building he'd ever explored, old hospitals, schools, government offices, trying to find another one. He became hyper-aware, sniffing the air for unusual scents, listening for impossible sounds, his flashlight beam dancing over every surface. Weeks blurred into months. His friends noticed his withdrawal, the gauntness in his face, the haunted look in his eyes. He mumbled about the rooms, about impossible spaces, and they exchanged worried glances. He stopped posting his videos, his focus narrowed to this singular, terrifying pursuit. Then he found another one. It was in the old St. Jude's Hospital, a notoriously sprawling and dangerous complex, its lower floors flooded, its upper floors a labyrinth of peeling paint and broken glass. He was deep in the surgical wing, a place where the ghostly scent of antiseptic still clung to the air like a pall. He passed an operating theater, its light fixture dangling precariously, before turning into a side corridor. And there it was, not a beige door this time, but a dark, polished wooden one, set incongruously into a wall of crumbling concrete and rusted pipes. It had a brass plaque that read, Dr. Elias Thorne, Head of Neurology. He hesitated longer this time, the memory of Atlas Mills' disappearing room a cold knot in his stomach. But the compulsion was too strong. He needed answers. He needed to know if he was insane. The door creaked open, revealing an office. Not a derelict hospital office, but a functional one. A heavy oak desk stood in the center, laden with neatly stacked medical journals, a fountain pen resting on a blotter, and a half-empty teacup. The air smelled of old paper, leather, and faint pipe tobacco. A single-bulb desk lamp, its brass base gleaming, was switched on, casting a warm, intimate glow over the desk. The light, that was the impossible part. There was no power in St. Jude's. The entire hospital was dark, its windows boarded or shattered, yet this lamp was on. He stepped inside. The room was unnervingly quiet, a haven of order in a world of chaos. He glanced at the journals. They were real medical texts from the late 1960s, early 70s. The teacup was porcelain, delicately painted. There was a faint ring of tea residue inside. Then he saw it. A dark, leather-bound diary tucked beneath a stack of papers on the desk. He reached for it, his hand trembling. As his fingers brushed the cool leather, he heard a sound, a soft click, like a lock turning. He froze. The door behind him, which he'd left ajar, was now shut. Not just closed, but firmly, definitively locked. Panic seized him. He lunged for the door, twisting the knob. It was solid, unmoving. He pushed, he pulled, he hammered on it. Nothing. The heavy oak absorbed his efforts, mocking him with its silence. His breath came in ragged gasps. He spun around, his flashlight beam wildly sweeping the room. He was trapped. In a pristine, impossible office in the heart of a dead hospital. Then he heard it again. A different sound this time, a low, rhythmic scratch. It came from beneath the desk. He lowered his beam. His blood ran cold. Beneath the desk, where one would expect legs or empty space, there was a small, crudely carved wooden box. And from its lid, a thin, skeletal hand was emerging, its long, yellowed fingernail scraping lightly against the wood. It was impossibly thin, almost translucent, its skin stretched taut over sharp bones. It twitched like a spider's leg, and then slowly, deliberately began to pull itself out of the box. Alex didn't wait. He screamed a raw, terrified sound and lunged at the door again, pounding with desperate, unthinking force. He screamed until his throat was raw, until his lungs burned. He screamed until he heard a faint click and the door gave. He burst out into the dark, decaying corridor, stumbling, gasping, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He didn't look back. He ran blindly through the labyrinthine hospital, the screams still echoing in his ears, though whether they were his own or something else's, he couldn't tell. He made it out, somehow collapsing into the overgrown weeds outside, choking on the damp, cold air. His GoPro, still recording, showed his frenzied escape, but when he reviewed the footage later, the office was just a blurred wall. And there was no hand, no box, just him screaming at nothing, then running from a blank wall. He knew then. He wasn't insane, or if he was, so was reality itself. These rooms were real, and they were finding him. The rooms became his waking nightmare. They started appearing everywhere, not just in grand, sprawling ruins, but in smaller, forgotten places. A meticulously maintained 1950s diner booth in the middle of a condemned warehouse. A child's bedroom complete with worn teddy bears and crayon drawings in a derelict tenement building. A bustling, antiquated newsroom complete with clattering typewriters in the basement of a gutted library. They were always perfectly preserved, always out of time, and always unnervingly occupied. Not by people, not by living beings in the conventional sense, but by evidence of life. A still steaming cup of coffee, a half-written letter. A jacket carelessly tossed over a chair, a warm indentation on a pillow. He never saw anyone, not directly, but he felt them. A faint warmth lingering in the air, a sudden drop in temperature, a fleeting shadow in the periphery of his vision. The distinct impression of being watched. His attempts to document them grew more desperate. He tried different cameras, different angles. He even bought an old film camera, hoping the analog format might bypass whatever digital interference was happening. But it was always the same, static, blur, or simply a shot of a crumbling wall where the room should have been. It was as if the rooms existed outside the tangible spectrum of his equipment, visible only to his own terrified eyes. His physical health deteriorated. He stopped eating properly, consumed by his obsession. He rarely slept, tormented by vivid nightmares where the rooms shifted and merged, and shadowy figures with indistinct faces moved just beyond his grasp. He started carrying a pry bar and a large, heavy-duty crowbar, not for breaking into buildings, but for defense. Against what, he didn't know. But the fear that he would eventually encounter one of the occupants face to face was a constant, gnawing dread. One frigid autumn evening, he found himself outside the old Hawthorne Asylum, a place he'd sworn he would never re-enter. Its reputation for darkness preceded it, even among urbex circles. But something pulled him there, an insistent whisper in the back of his mind. The main building was a Gothic monstrosity, its broken windows like vacant eyes. He slipped through a gap in the perimeter fence, the barbed wire tearing a new rip in his already worn jacket. The moon was a sliver, casting long, menacing shadows. Inside, the asylum was a symphony of desolation. The air was heavy with the ghosts of screams and despair. He moved through the wards, past overturned beds and rusted medical equipment, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the oppressive gloom. He felt colder than usual, a deep, bone-chilling cold that had nothing to do with the outside temperature. He found it in the furthest wing, a section once reserved for the most violent patients, its walls covered in desperate, faded scrawls. A door plain and unadorned of dark, unvarnished wood. No knob, no hinges visible, just a seamless rectangle like a portal. He didn't need to try it. He knew it would open. He knew he had to go in. He pushed and the door swung inward silently. This time it wasn't a living room or an office or a diner. It was a corridor, a perfectly normal, perfectly clean, perfectly lit corridor. Not a harsh, fluorescent light, but a warm, inviting glow from sconces on the wall. The floor was polished linoleum, reflecting the light. On either side there were a series of doors, all identical, all closed, each with a small, brass-plated number. It was an apartment building corridor, or perhaps a hotel. The air here was warm, almost too warm, and smelled faintly of disinfectant and something else, something cloying like lilies. Alex stepped inside. The door behind him clicked shut with an ominous finality, plunging the asylum's darkness back into the periphery. He was in an entirely different space, a different reality. His heart hammered against his ribs. He felt a profound sense of terror mixed with a strange, morbid curiosity. This was it. This was the source. This was the impossible network. He walked down the corridor, his boots making soft, almost reverent thuds on the polished floor. The numbers on the doors caught his attention. They weren't sequential in a human way. Door 1, then door 7, then door 34, then door 2. It was like a shuffled deck of cards. He approached door 7. He heard a faint sound from within, a low, rhythmic humming. Hesitantly, he pressed his ear to the wood. The humming seemed to vibrate through the door itself, a deep, resonant tone that felt both mechanical and organic. It was unsettling. He moved to door 34, silence, then a single sharp thump like something heavy falling. He tried the knob on door 2, it turned. He pushed the door open just a crack and peered inside. It was a bedroom, small, sparsely furnished. A narrow bed, its sheets pristine white, a small dresser. a single window through which he saw not the moonless night and broken trees of the asylum, but a vibrant, sun-drenched cityscape, impossibly bright and modern, with sleek skyscrapers reaching into a clear blue sky. A city he didn't recognize, a city that didn't exist outside of science fiction. And on the bed, lying perfectly still beneath the crisp white sheet, was a figure. It was covered from head to toe by the sheet, only the vague outline of a human form visible. Too still, unmoving, a low moan, soft and drawn out, came from beneath the sheet. It wasn't human. It was thin, reedy, like wind through dry reeds, and utterly devoid of emotion. Alex's blood ran cold. He backed away from the door slowly, quietly, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He pulled the door shut, his eyes wide with unholy dread. He continued down the corridor, his mind screaming at him to turn back, to run, but his feet moved independently, drawn by an unseen force. He was a moth to a flame, utterly compelled. He passed more doors. From one he heard the faint, distorted strains of a piano playing a mournful, cyclical tune. From another, a soft, dry whisper, like countless leaves skittering across pavement. From yet another, the distinct, slow drip of water, each drop echoing like a chime. He reached the end of the corridor. There was one last door. It stood slightly ajar. He pushed it open fully. It was his room, his apartment. The sterile box downtown, the one he'd abandoned in his frantic quest. His bed, unmade from when he'd last slept there weeks ago. His laptop on the desk, still open to the urbex forums he frequented. His backpack casually tossed in the corner. His camera equipment scattered on the floor, everything exactly as he'd left it. He stepped inside, his boots sinking into his own carpet. The air smelled of him, of stale coffee and old clothes. He walked to the window. Outside, it was the exact view from his actual apartment, the familiar cityscape, the distant hum of traffic, the streetlights glowing. But through the grimy, broken window of the asylum, he had seen something else entirely. He was inside his apartment, but he was also impossibly still in the asylum. He turned, a profound sense of disorientation washing over him. He was home, he was safe, the horror was over. But then his eyes fell on his bedside table. A single object rested there, a small wooden box, crudely carved, the same box he'd seen in Dr. Thorne's office in St. Jude's. And from its slightly ajar lid, a thin skeletal hand, its long, yellowed fingernail was slowly, deliberately emerging. It wasn't scraping against the wood now. It was reaching towards him. A wave of understanding, cold and absolute, washed over Alex. He wasn't in his room was here. It was another one of them, another place for them to occupy. He hadn't found the rooms had found him. They had drawn him in piece by piece, building by building, until they had assembled his own space just for him. He was one of the occupants now. He felt a profound chill, deeper than any he'd ever known. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. His vocal cords felt seized, frozen, his muscles locked. He couldn't move. He couldn't look away from the hand, which was now fully emerged, its translucent fingers flexing slowly, beckoning. The apartment walls, which had seemed so solid, began to ripple. The edges of the furniture blurred. The familiar view outside the window began to waver, replaced by fleeting glimpses of decaying hospital wards, of darkened factory floors, of crumbling concrete. His vision swam. He felt himself falling, not through space, but through layers of reality, each sensation a new, horrifying truth. The air in his lungs felt heavy, metallic, as if he was breathing dust and rust, not oxygen. The smell of disinfectant, of lilies, of pipe tobacco, of potpourri, all mingled, suffocating him. He saw in the corner of his blurred vision a shape, tall, indistinct, standing just beyond the flickering outline of his familiar wardrobe. It was one of them, and it was watching him. Other shapes began to coalesce just at the edge of his perception, filling the room, not quite solid, not quite shadow, the occupants, his new neighbors. He felt a soft pressure on his shoulder. A gentle, reassuring touch. He couldn't turn his head to see. He knew instinctively it was the hand. His last coherent thought was not of escape, but of resignation. This was it. This was the end of exploration, the beginning of occupation. He was just another piece of furniture, another forgotten detail in one of the endless rooms. His memories, his fears, his very essence would be absorbed, meticulously preserved, and quietly, eternally displayed. The light from his apartment window flickered, then dimmed. The city outside dissolved into a kaleidoscope of impossible light and shadow, the sounds of traffic replaced by the endless, rhythmic humming. His own reflection in the darkened glass of the window showed not Alex, but a vacant, indistinct silhouette, perfectly still. Just another shadow in a well-kept room. The story of the urban explorer lost to the spaces he loved, the spaces that ultimately claimed him.